February 1944. A German engineer at Rheinmetall-Borsig watched another prototype shatter into fragments. The glass vacuum tubes had exploded the moment the artillery shell fired again. The silence that followed was heavier than the blast itself. It was the sound of a superpower running out of time. For the 50th time, they had chased a ghost, a weapon the Americans had seemingly conjured out of thin air. A shell that could sense when it was close to a target and detonate automatically. They called it a proximity fuse. The concept was simple. The engineering was supposed to be impossible, yet intelligence reports suggested the Americans had somehow solved the problem. Shells that detonated in mid-air with impossible precision. Shells that seemed to know when they were close to a target. The German engineers stared at the wreckage of another failed test and asked himself the same question every engineer in the Reich was asking. What did the Americans figure out that they couldn't? Every artilleryman since the invention of the cannon had dreamed of the same thing, a shell that knew when to explode. For centuries, gunners had two options: contact fuses that only detonated on direct impact, or timed fuses that required calculating exactly how long the shell would fly before reaching the target. Against aircraft, both options were nearly useless. The odds of scoring a direct hit on a fast-moving plane were astronomical. Timed fuses required perfect calculations that were almost never perfect. The mathematics were brutal. Anti-aircraft guns firing timed fuses needed thousands of shells to bring down a single aircraft. Estimates ranged from 2,500 to over 10,000, depending on conditions. A shell that could sense when an airplane was nearby and explode automatically would change everything, 5 to 10 times more lethal than anything that existed. Every major power understood this. The British had been working on it since 1939. The Germans had started even earlier, in the early 1930s. But understanding the concept and building one that worked were completely different problems. The challenge wasn't building a proximity sensor. That technology already existed. The challenge was building one that could survive being shot from a cannon. Every artillery shell leaves the barrel, experiences forces that would destroy almost any electronic device ever made. Acceleration of 20,000 times the force of gravity, instantaneous. But it wasn't just the linear acceleration. The shell spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute, centrifugal force trying to tear the circuits apart from the inside out. The temperature inside the barrel exceeds 3,000 degrees for a fraction of a second. Any proximity fuse would need vacuum tubes to function as a tiny radar set. Glass tubes, delicate filaments, circuits that would shatter into powder under those forces. Every engineer who studied the problem reached the same conclusion. It couldn't be done. The physics made it impossible. Germany had the best precision engineering in the world. They built the V-2 rocket. They built jet engines. They built guidance systems that could hit targets from hundreds of miles away. But they couldn't build a vacuum tube that survived being shot from a cannon. Germany didn't try once or twice. They threw everything at the problem. Between 1933 and 1945, the German military distributed 50 separate research contracts across different firms and universities. The effort was fragmented. The Luftwaffe and Army competed for resources instead of collaborating. Acoustic fuses that listened for engine noise. Electrostatic fuses that sensed electrical fields. Infrared fuses that detected heat. Radio fuses that worked like miniature radar sets. Projects with code names like Chronic, Fuchs, Marabou, Kakadu, Kugelblitz. Different teams at different companies attacking the problem from every angle. Rheinmetall-Borsig came closest with an electrostatic design called Kugelko. Testing at Kummerdorf showed it actually worked. They scheduled production for March 1945. Allied forces overran the factory before a single operational fuse was produced. Despite all these diverse approaches, every German program hit the same wall. The physics of the gun barrel remained undefeated. By 1944, German High Command had concluded that a gun-fired proximity fuse was theoretically impossible. They focused their efforts on fuses for missiles instead, where acceleration forces were gentler.
They had no idea what was about to hit them. August 1940. The United States wasn't even in the war yet, but a physicist named Merle Tuvey at the Carnegie Institution in Washington had received an impossible assignment: build a proximity fuse that could be fired from naval anti-aircraft guns. The Navy was terrified of what Japanese aircraft might do to the Pacific Fleet. They needed better air defense. They needed shells that actually hit their targets. Tuvey assembled a team at what would become Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. Their workspace was the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, a facility that normally studied the Earth's magnetic field. Now it would
to solve a problem every other nation had declared unsolvable. Tuvey understood immediately that the vacuum tube was the key. If they could build a tube that survived 20,000 Gs of acceleration, everything else was just engineering. If they couldn't, none of it mattered. The solution came from an unexpected source: hearing aids. While Germany searched for answers in grand engineering theories, American researchers found it in consumer electronics. It was a quintessentially American moment, discovering a weapon of war in the tools of everyday life. Raytheon and other American companies had spent years miniaturizing vacuum tubes for the hearing aid industry. Tiny tubes the size of a pencil eraser, designed to be rugged enough for everyday use. A young physicist named James Van Allen, the same Van Allen who would later discover the radiation belts surrounding Earth, spent nearly a year working with these miniature tubes. The breakthrough was counterintuitive. They potted the tiny glass tubes in blocks of ethyl cellulose, a specific plastic resin that was neither too brittle nor too soft. The material distributed the G-force evenly across the components, allowing them to flex slightly instead of shattering. They fired test shells from a homemade cannon made of gas pipe, recovering them in a farmer's field to see what survived. They dropped tubes off buildings. They shot .22 caliber bullets at them. By early 1941, they had vacuum tubes that could withstand 22,000 Gs of acceleration. Germany's best engineers had declared this impossible. American researchers solved it in less than a year. A working tube was just the beginning. Now they had to build an entire radar set small enough to fit in the nose of an artillery shell. Each fuse required 130 miniaturized electronic parts, 5 of Van Allen's special vacuum tubes, a tiny battery that activated only when the shell was fired, circuits that had to work perfectly after experiencing forces that would crush a human being into paste. The battery alone was an engineering miracle. Standard batteries would go dead sitting in storage. National Carbon Company designed one where the shell's own firing shock shattered a glass ampule, releasing fluid that activated the battery at the moment it was needed. Safety features used the shell's rotation. Components were deliberately misaligned until centrifugal force spun them into position, preventing accidental detonation during handling. By August 1942, the fuse was ready for testing. Gun batteries aboard the cruiser USS Cleveland fired proximity-fused ammunition at radio-controlled drone aircraft over Chesapeake Bay. The test was supposed to take 2 days. They destroyed all 3 drones in the first few hours. 4 shells, 3 kills. Mass production began in September 1942. The scale was staggering. Over 100 companies manufactured fuse components. More than 2,000 suppliers and sub-suppliers contributed parts. Crowley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, Sylvania, General Electric, Westinghouse, the entire American electronics industry mobilized. At its peak, this single component was devouring 1/4 of the entire American electronics industry's output. The program would eventually cost approximately $1 billion, roughly $15 to $20 billion in today's money. It was one of the 3 largest weapons development projects of the war, alongside only the atomic bomb and radar. Cost per fuse dropped from $732 in 1942 to $18 by 1945 as manufacturing efficiency improved. By war's end, American factories had produced over 22 million proximity fuses. The fuse was classified at the same level as the atomic bomb. Its existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, and the Pentagon was terrified of what would happen if the Germans captured one. The proximity fuse worked too well. That became its own problem. Military leadership feared that if the Germans recovered a dud shell, they could reverse engineer the technology.
German proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells could devastate Allied bomber formations. The Pentagon imposed strict restrictions. The fuse could only be
used over water where duds would sink and be unrecoverable. Navy ships in the Pacific were authorized to use them against Japanese aircraft, but ground forces in Europe were forbidden from using proximity-fused artillery against German troops. The risk of a dud falling into enemy hands was too great. The restriction held through 1943 and most of 1944. Allied soldiers fought and died in Normandy in the hedgerows across France without access to a weapon that could have saved thousands of lives. This was the agonizing paradox of the VT fuse, a lifesaver that stayed in a box, a miracle kept under lock and key while the casualty lists grew longer. The fuses sat in warehouses, waiting. Then came December 1944. December 16, 1944. German forces launched their last major offensive through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge caught Allied forces completely by surprise. German armor smashed through American lines. Entire divisions were surrounded or destroyed. The situation was desperate. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had known about the proximity fuse for months. He had watched it sit in warehouses while his men died fighting with inferior weapons. Now, with the German offensive threatening to split his armies in two, Eisenhower demanded authorization to use the fuses. He didn't ask, he demanded. The Pentagon resistance collapsed. Within days of the German attack, all restrictions on proximity fuse use were lifted. 200,000 shells with VT fuses, codenamed Payzet, were rushed to artillery units across the Ardennes. Gunners who had never seen the weapon were given hasty training. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Within days, the first proximity-fused artillery hit German positions. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Shells that had always buried themselves in the ground before exploding now detonated 30 to 50 feet in the air. Shrapnel rained down on everything below. Foxholes provided no protection. Log-reinforced bunkers were penetrated. There was nowhere to hide from shells that exploded above you. It wasn't just the shrapnel that broke the German lines, it was the helplessness. When your foxhole becomes a target instead of a sanctuary, the will to fight vanishes. In the blindness of the Ardennes fog, the American shells found their targets with terrifying autonomy. Every barrage caught troops in the open who thought they were safe. Prisoners of war described the attacks as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. They emerged from barrages in a dazed state, unable to comprehend what they had experienced. Within days, German commanders noticed something they had never seen before. German soldiers started refusing orders. The German army didn't just stop, it froze in a collective shock. When artillery began falling, troops wouldn't leave their bunkers. Officers who ordered men to advance during bombardments found themselves ignored. The effectiveness of the air-bursting shells had broken something fundamental. Near Malmedy, American artillery caught SS troops in the open. Some soldiers ran directly toward the American gun, screaming "Kamerad," surrendering into the artillery fire rather than enduring another moment under the airbursts. By December 23rd, intelligence estimated over 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds in a single sector. German commanders offered rewards to any soldier who could recover an unexploded American shell with its fuse intact. They needed to understand what they were facing. They needed to know if they could copy it. None were ever recovered. General George Patton was the first senior commander to understand what the proximity fuse meant for warfare. In late December, Patton's Third Army caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River. American artillery fired a concentrated barrage with the new fuses. The results were counted precisely. 702 German soldiers killed in a single engagement. Patton wrote to the War Department immediately. He called it the funny fuse. He said the new shell was devastating. He said that when all armies got this weapon, someone would have to devise an entirely new method of warfare.
Then he added the words that captured everything. He was glad the Americans thought of it first. Patton's assessment was brutal and accurate. The proximity fuse had changed the mathematics of ground combat. Defensive positions that had protected soldiers for centuries were now death traps. After the war, Allied investigators examined Germany's proximity fuse programs. They wanted to understand why the best precision engineers in the world had failed. The answer came down to two factors working against each other. Germany never developed a consumer electronics industry that required miniaturized, rugged components. American hearing aid companies had already solved that problem for commercial reasons before the military ever asked. And while American scientists unified under Section T with a single goal, German research was a house divided. The Luftwaffe and Army competing for resources on vacuum tubes they couldn't even get to work. Meanwhile, American factories were producing them by the millions. Germany tried 50 times to build a proximity fuse. 50 programs, 50 failures. The physics was understood, the engineering was within reach, but the manufacturing base that could make it work simply didn't exist in Germany. It existed in America, in factories that made hearing aids before they ever made weapons. 50 attempts, everyone failed, and the Americans only needed